A silent mansion, a snowstorm, and a knock at the door. The old Whittaker mansion stood on the hilltop, blanketed in heavy snow that shimmered under the pale light of the crescent moon. Its towering walls of cold stone seemed to whisper tales of grandeur, now reduced to shadows of regret. Inside, Charles Whittaker, a man in his late 50s with graying hair and sharp, tired eyes, sat at the head of a long dining table. The table was a stark contrast to his solitary figure. A feast of roasted turkey, glazed carrots, golden potatoes, and rich cranberry sauce sat untouched, the steam from the dishes long since faded. Across from him, 24 chairs stood vacant, silent reminders of a life that had once been full of laughter, family, and warmth. Charles adjusted his silk tie for the third time that evening. Even when no one was there to notice, he maintained his habits of perfection. The flickering light of the chandelier cast distorted reflections on his whiskey glass, the amber liquid his only company on yet another cold Christmas Eve. Outside, the wind howled, and snowflakes tapped against the tall windows like 1,000 ghostly fingers. Bing Crosby's "I'll Be Home for Christmas" played faintly from the kitchen radio, its lyrics striking a bitter irony. Charles raised his glass in a mock toast. "Home," he muttered, the word tinged with bitterness, a word that doesn't mean much anymore. He took a long sip, the alcohol burning his throat, but failing to warm the ache in his chest. His gaze drifted to the empty chairs around him. He could still see their faces, his children, now grown and estranged, and the woman he once loved, her voice ringing in his ears like a haunting melody. "Another year," Charles muttered bitterly, raising his glass to the empty room. "Another year of mistakes." A sudden sound interrupted his thoughts, a knock at the front door. It was faint at first, almost drowned out by the crackling fire. He froze, his glass halfway to his lips, listening intently. A second knock followed, more urgent this time. Charles set his glass down and rose from his chair, his footsteps echoing in the empty halls as he approached the massive oak door. The brass handle was cold under his touch as he pulled it open, letting in a rush of icy wind that bit at his face and carried with it the faint scent of pine and frost. There, standing on the doorstep, was a boy. He couldn't have been older than 12, his thin frame shivering beneath a threadbare jacket that was far too light for the bitter cold. His dark skin had taken on an ashen pallor, and his lips trembled as he looked up at Charles with wide, pleading eyes. "Please, sir," the boy stammered, his teeth chattering so violently that his words were barely audible. "I'm cold, and I have nowhere else to go." Charles stood frozen, his hand still gripping the door as he studied the boy. The child's soaked sneakers left dark spots on the marble steps, and a puddle of melting snow was already forming beneath his feet. His face was pale, his cheeks raw from the wind, and his eyes, those eyes, held a desperation that struck something deep within Charles. "Who are you?" Charles demanded, his voice sharper than he intended. "How did you get past the gates?" The boy flinched at the tone, but didn't back away. Instead, he wrapped his arms tightly around himself, his small shoulders hunching against the cold. "I walked," he whispered, his voice barely carrying over the wind. "My mom, before she died, she told me to find you." The name hit Charles like a physical blow. His grip on the door tightened, his knuckles turning white, as memories he had tried to bury for years came rushing back. "Lila," he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. How do you know that name?" The boy's eyes filled with tears, his lips quivering as he spoke. "She was my mom," he said, his voice cracking with emotion. "She told me, if I was ever in trouble, I should come to you. She said you'd help me." Charles stumbled back a step, the weight of the boy's words hitting him like a freight train. He stared at the child, his mind racing with questions he wasn't sure he wanted answered. Against his better judgment, he stepped aside. "Come in," he said gruffly, his voice heavy with emotion he couldn't quite mask. "Before you freeze to death, The boy hesitated for only a moment before stepping inside, his small frame trembling as the warmth of the house enveloped him. Charles closed the door against the cold, his heart pounding as he watched the boy shuffle toward the living room, leaving a trail of melting snow in his wake. As they entered the room, the fire's glow bathed the boy in light, highlighting the hollows of his cheeks and the exhaustion etched into his young face. Charles handed him a wool blanket and a steaming mug of hot chocolate, which the boy accepted with shaking hands. "What's your name?" Charles asked, keeping his tone steady even as his thoughts spiraled. "Jeremiah," the boy said softly, his voice barely audible as he sipped the hot chocolate. Charles stared at the boy, his heart a battlefield of emotions he couldn't yet name. He saw traces of Lila in the child's face, the curve of his cheek, the set of his jaw, the way his eyes seemed to hold the weight of the world. The realization hit him with the force of a tidal wave. This wasn't just some lost child seeking refuge. This was Lila's son. His son. The unspoken truths and shadows of the past. The living room was warm and inviting, its grand fireplace casting flickering shadows across the walls. Jeremiah sat huddled on the leather couch, the thick wool blanket wrapped tightly around his small frame. His trembling hands gripped the mug of hot chocolate, the steam rising in lazy spirals as he took small, hesitant sips. For the first time in what felt like forever, he wasn't shivering, but his wide, wary eyes betrayed his unease. Charles stood at a distance, his arms crossed tightly over his chest as he watched the boy. Questions swirled in his mind, each one more unsettling than the last. Who had Jeremiah's mother become in the years after they parted ways? Why hadn't Lila ever reached out to him? And most pressing of all, how could he have a son, a child he never knew existed? "Jeremiah," Charles said, his voice low and uncertain, as if speaking the boy's name aloud might solidify the storm of emotions swirling inside him. The boy looked up, his dark, expressive eyes locking onto Charles with a mixture of fear and fragile hope. "Where have you been staying?" Charles asked, his tone softer this time. He moved to the armchair across from the couch, sitting down and leaning forward, his elbows resting on his knees. Jeremiah hesitated, his fingers tightening around the mug. "Here and there," he said quietly. "Shelters mostly. Sometimes." He trailed off, his eyes flickering to the floor as though the rest of his answer might shame him. "Sometimes, outside." Charles felt his stomach twist at the words. A child, his child, had been sleeping on the streets while he lived in this empty mansion, surrounded by more wealth and comfort than any one person could ever need. The thought was almost too much to bear. "How long?" Charles pressed, though he wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. 3 weeks, Jeremiah admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. After Mom died." Charles closed his eyes briefly, the weight of Jeremiah's words crashing down on him. Lila was gone. The woman he had loved, truly loved, was no longer walking this earth. And she had left behind a son he never knew about, a boy who had been forced to fend for himself in a world that had shown him no mercy. "What happened to her?" Charles asked, his throat tightening. The question felt like a betrayal of the years he had spent trying to forget her, but he needed to know. Jeremiah's face crumpled, and for a moment, Charles thought the boy might refuse to answer. But then he spoke, his voice trembling with barely suppressed emotion. "Cancer," he said. It happened fast. One day, she was fine. And the next, she couldn't get out of bed. We didn't have money for the treatments. She said it was okay. But I knew it wasn't." The boy's hand shook as he placed the mug down on the coffee table, his gaze fixed on the fire. "She told me to be strong," Jeremiah continued, his voice breaking. "She said, if anything ever happened to her, I should find you." Charles leaned back in his chair, his breath catching in his throat. He felt like he was drowning in a sea of guilt, regret, and anger. Anger at himself for walking away from Lila all those years ago. Anger at the world for taking her away. And anger at the boy's words for cracking open a wound he had spent over a decade trying to seal. "I'm sorry," Charles said, the words heavy and unfamiliar on his tongue. He wasn't a man who apologized often, but in this moment, they were all he could offer. Jeremiah didn't respond. He simply pulled the blanket tighter around himself and stared into the fire, his small frame seeming even smaller in the glow of the dancing flames. The letters. Later that evening, after Jeremiah had fallen asleep on the couch, Charles found himself in his study. The room was dark, save for the warm light of the desk lamp and the faint glow of the fireplace. He poured himself another glass of whiskey, the crystal decanter catching the firelight as he swirled the amber liquid. On the desk before him sat a small wooden box, its surface worn smooth with age. Charles hadn't opened it in years, not since the day he packed away everything that reminded him of Lila. His hand hovered over the lid, hesitation gripping him like a vice. Did he really want to revisit those memories? Did he even have the right? With a deep breath, Charles opened the box. Inside were remnants of a life he had tried to forget. Concert ticket stubs, dried flowers, and a stack of yellowed envelopes tied with a faded blue ribbon. His hands trembled as he untied the ribbon, the letters spilling out onto the desk. The first letter was dated 13 years ago, just weeks after he had ended his relationship with Lila. The handwriting was unmistakably hers, graceful, looping, and full of emotion. Dear Charles, I don't understand why you left. Was your father's approval worth throwing away what we had? I loved you with all my heart, and now I'm left wondering if it was all a lie. If you ever cared about me, please answer me. Please don't let this silence be the end of us. Charles closed his eyes, the words hitting him like a physical blow. He had ignored that letter, too consumed by his father's expectations and his own cowardice to face the consequences of his choices. He picked up another letter, this one dated 5 years later. The paper was slightly crisper, but the pain in her words was just as raw. I've tried to reach you so many times, Charles, but you never respond. There's something you need to know. We have a son. His name is Jeremiah, and he's everything good in this world. He has your smile and your way of thinking. Sometimes, when he's lost in thought, I see you in every gesture. I'm writing this because he deserves to know his father, even if you've decided not to know him. Charles set the letter down, his vision blurring with tears. His hand shook as he reached for another, and then another, each one revealing a piece of a life he had missed. Jeremiah's first steps, his first words, his love for drawing. It was all there, written in Lila's elegant script. She had tried to share their son's life with him, and he had ignored every single attempt. At the bottom of the stack, he found a photograph. It was a picture of Lila sitting on a park bench, her arm around a young boy who could only be Jeremiah. Her smile was tired but genuine, and the love in her eyes was unmistakable. I'm so sorry, Lila, Charles whispered, his voice breaking. He ran his thumb over the photograph, tracing the lines of her face. I failed you. I failed both of you. A plan for redemption. The next morning, Charles woke early. He found Jeremiah sitting cross-legged on the floor by the fireplace, his sketchbook balanced on his knees. The boy's pencil moved swiftly across the page, his expression focused and serious. Charles watched him for a moment, marveling at the talent and determination in such a young child. Jeremiah, Charles said, his voice softer than it had been the night before. The boy looked up, his eyes wary. I've been thinking, would you like to have your own space to draw? A room where you can create whatever you want? Jeremiah blinked, clearly caught off guard by the question. You mean, like an art room? Charles nodded. Yes, you deserve a place where you can express yourself. Jeremiah hesitated, his pencil hovering over the page. Why are you being so nice to me? The question made Charles's chest tighten. He knelt down beside the boy, meeting his eyes directly. Because I should have been there for you a long time ago. I made mistakes, Jeremiah, big ones. But I want to make things right, if you'll let me. The boy studied him for a long moment, his gaze searching Charles's face for any sign of insincerity. Finally, he nodded, a small, hesitant smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "Okay," he said softly. It was a small step, but it was a start. Shadows of doubt, and the battle for trust. The early morning sunlight streamed through the tall windows of the Whittaker mansion, casting golden beams on the polished floors. Jeremiah sat on the floor near the fireplace, his new sketchbook open on his lap. His pencil moved in slow, deliberate strokes, the kind that spoke of caution rather than passion. Charles watched from a distance, his heart heavy with the weight of unspoken words. The silence between them wasn't hostile, but it wasn't comfortable either. Charles had spent the last day trying to bridge the gap between them, offering warm meals and small gestures of kindness, but Jeremiah's guarded demeanor hadn't wavered. The boy was like a fortress, his walls high and unyielding, and Charles wasn't sure he had the tools to break through. He cleared his throat, drawing Jeremiah's attention. "Jeremiah," he began cautiously, "I've been thinking about what you told me. About your mom." Jeremiah's hand stilled on the page, his eyes flickering up to meet Charles. There was a flicker of pain there, raw and unhidden, but he said nothing. Charles hesitated, unsure of how to continue. He wasn't used to conversations like this, ones that required vulnerability and emotional honesty. But he knew he couldn't afford to falter. "Not now. I wasn't there when she needed me," he admitted, his voice low and steady. "I made mistakes I can't take back. But I want to be here for you now. I want to help you in any way I can." Jeremiah looked at him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he turned back to his sketchbook, his pencil resuming its careful movements. "Why now?" he asked quietly. "Why do you care all of a sudden?" The question hit Charles like a punch to the gut. He opened his mouth to respond, but found himself at a loss for words. How could he explain the years of regret, the nights spent staring at the empty chairs around his dining table, the memories of Lila that haunted him like ghosts? "Because it's the right thing to do," he said finally, though even to his own ears, the words felt hollow. Jeremiah didn't respond. He simply continued to sketch, his focus seemingly unbroken. But Charles noticed the tension in the boy's shoulders, the way his hand trembled slightly as he worked. The boy wasn't as indifferent as he seemed. He was listening, even if he wasn't ready to show it. The arrival of Marcia. The next morning, the calm of the mansion was shattered by the sound of a car pulling up to the front gate. Charles glanced out the window and saw a sleek black sedan parked in the driveway. A woman stepped out, her sharp heels clicking against the stone as she approached the door with purpose. Charles recognized her immediately. Marcia Reed, Lila's sister. He opened the door before she could knock, his expression guarded. "Marcia," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "This is unexpected." Marcia's eyes narrowed, her sharp gaze cutting through him like a blade. "Unexpected," she repeated, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "You think I wouldn't come running the moment I found out my nephew was here? What gives you the right to take him in without so much as a phone call?" Charles's jaw tightened. Jeremiah came to me on his own. He was on the streets, Marcia, freezing and alone. What was I supposed to do? Turn him away? Marcia crossed her arms, her expression unyielding. "You've got a lot of nerve acting like a hero now. Where were you when Lila needed you? When Jeremiah needed you?" The question hung in the air like a loaded gun, and Charles felt the weight of it settle on his chest. He had no defense, no justification for his actions, or lack thereof. But he wasn't about to let Marcia take the moral high ground without a fight. "I'm trying to make things right," he said firmly. "I know I can't change the past, but I can give Jeremiah a future, a safe, stable future." Marcia laughed bitterly. "Safe, stable? You mean locked away in this gilded cage while you parade him around like some redemption project? You think money fixes everything, Charles, but it doesn't. It won't fix this." From the living room, Jeremiah peeked out cautiously, his wide eyes darting between the two adults. His small frame seemed to shrink under the weight of the tension, and Charles felt a pang of guilt at having dragged the boy into this confrontation. "Jeremiah," Marcia said, softening her tone as she turned to him. "Pack your things, sweetheart. You're coming with me." Jeremiah froze, his gaze shifting to Charles, as if searching for guidance. For a moment, the boy looked like he might comply. But then he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't want to go." Marcia's expression hardened. "Jeremiah, this isn't up for debate. You're a child. You don't get to make these decisions." "I said I don't want to go." Jeremiah's voice cracked as he shouted, his small hands clenching into fists at his sides. "Why can't anyone just listen to me?" The outburst stunned both adults into silence. Marcia's mouth opened and closed as if she were searching for a response, but it was Charles who spoke first. "Jeremiah stays here," he said firmly, stepping in front of the boy protectively. "If you want to fight me on this, Marcia, go ahead, but you won't take him without a legal battle." Marcia's eyes flashed with anger, but she didn't argue. Instead, she turned on her heel and stormed out, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. The door slammed shut behind her, leaving an echo that seemed to vibrate through the entire house. The letter. That evening, after Marcia's departure, Charles found Jeremiah sitting on the window seat in his room, his knees drawn to his chest. The boy's sketchbook lay discarded beside him, and his face was pale and drawn. Charles approached slowly, his footsteps soft on the carpet. "Jeremiah," he said gently, sitting down beside the boy. "I know today was hard, but I want you to know you're safe here. No one is going to take you away." Jeremiah didn't respond at first, his gaze fixed on the darkened sky outside. But then he turned to Charles, his eyes brimming with unshed tears. "She didn't want me either, did she?" he asked, his voice trembling. "Marcia, she doesn't want me." Charles felt his heart break at the boy's words. He reached out, placing a reassuring hand on Jeremiah's shoulder. "That's not true," he said firmly. "Marcia cares about you. She's just angry. At me. At the world. But it's not your fault." Jeremiah looked down, his small hands twisting nervously in his lap. "Why did she hate you?" he asked. "Mom never said. She told me you were a good person." Charles hesitated, the weight of the truth pressing down on him. "Your mother and I." He paused, searching for the right words. "We were in love, but my father didn't approve. He was a difficult man, prejudiced, and I was too weak to stand up to him." Jeremiah looked at him, his gaze piercing. "So you left?" Charles nodded, the admission cutting deeper than he expected. "I did, and it's the biggest regret of my life." For a moment, silence filled the room, broken only by the distant sound of the wind outside. Then Jeremiah spoke, his voice soft but resolute. "She forgave you, you know. She told me you were kind, that you just made a mistake." Charles felt his throat tighten, the boy's words hitting him like a balm, and a dagger all at once. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "for telling me that." As the night deepened, Charles left Jeremiah to his thoughts, retreating to his study. There, he opened Lila's last letter once again, his hands trembling as he read her words. "Charles, if you're reading this, it means Jeremiah has found you. Please don't let him face this world alone. He's a good boy, a strong boy, but he needs you. He deserves to know that he's loved, even if I'm not there to tell them myself." Charles set the letter down, his vision blurring with tears. He had made a promise to Lila, and he intended to keep it, no matter what it took. A battle for custody and the secrets that surface. The grand Whittaker mansion felt eerily quiet the morning after Marcia's visit. The tension hung in the air like a storm waiting to break, and Charles could feel it in every corner of the house. Even the usual hum of the staff as they went about their duties seemed muted. It wasn't just a house anymore. It had become a battleground. Charles stood in his study, staring at the pile of letters spread across his desk. Each one was a piece of a story he'd ignored for years, a story he was now desperate to reclaim. He picked up the last letter Lila had written, her handwriting steady but filled with emotion. Her words echoed in his mind, heavy with the weight of her trust. "Jeremiah needs you, Charles. Be the man I always believed you could be." The knock at the door pulled him out of his thoughts. It was firm, deliberate, the kind of knock that announced trouble before the person even stepped inside. He opened the door to find David Thompson, his lawyer, and a man who had stood by his side during countless corporate battles. "David," Charles said, motioning for him to come in. "Thank you for coming on such short notice." David stepped into the study, his sharp gray suit perfectly tailored, and his expression serious. He carried a leather briefcase that he placed on the desk with a practiced motion. "Charles," he began, his tone professional but tinged with concern, "we need to talk. Marcia has already filed a petition for custody." Charles's jaw tightened as he sank into his chair. He had known this was coming, but hearing it out loud made it all the more real. "On what grounds?" he asked, his voice steady but laced with anger. David opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of papers. "She's claiming that Jeremiah's best interests would be served with her. She's citing your lack of involvement in his life, the suddenness of his arrival, and—" David paused, his lips pressing into a thin line. "Your reputation." Charles leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing. "My reputation?" he asked coldly. "What about hers?" "She left him in foster care. She's arguing that was temporary while she fought for custody," David explained. "And Charles, we need to be honest about this. She's going to play every card she has. Your past decisions will come under scrutiny." Charles ran a hand through his graying hair, frustration bubbling beneath the surface. "I don't care what they dig up about me. What matters is Jeremiah. He doesn't want to go with her, David. He's made that clear." David nodded, his expression softening. "I believe you, and I believe him. But the court system doesn't work on emotions. They'll want evidence, proof that you can provide a stable, nurturing environment. We need to show the judge that Jeremiah belongs here." Charles straightened in his chair, determination hardening his features. "Then that's what we'll do." Jeremiah's world. While Charles was in his study, Jeremiah sat cross-legged on the window seat in his room, staring out at the snow-covered grounds. His sketchbook was open on his lap, but for once, his pencil lay untouched. He felt like the walls of the mansion were closing in on him, and he couldn't shake the memory of Marcia's angry voice. He didn't know what he wanted anymore. A part of him longed for the life he'd had with his mother, the small apartment, the nights spent drawing while she read her favorite books aloud. But that life was gone, and nothing could bring it back. "Hey!" Charles's voice broke through his thoughts, and Jeremiah turned to see the man standing in the doorway. He looked different today. Not the cold, distant figure Jeremiah had first met, but someone who seemed unsure, human. "Can I come in?" Charles asked, his tone careful. Jeremiah nodded, shifting slightly to make space on the window seat. Charles sat down beside him, the two of them staring out at the snow in silence for a moment. "I know things have been hard," Charles began, his voice quiet. "And I know I haven't made it any easier. But I want you to know that I'm not going to let anyone take you away. Not Marcia. Not anyone." Jeremiah glanced at him, his expression skeptical. "Why do you care so much now?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Charles took a deep breath, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Because I should have cared a long time ago," he admitted. "I made mistakes, Jeremiah. Big ones. But I want to do better. For you. For your mom." Jeremiah didn't respond right away. He looked down at his sketchbook, his fingers tracing the edges of the paper. "She always said you were a good person," he said softly. "She said you just got scared." Charles felt a lump form in his throat at the boy's words. "She was too kind," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But she was right about one thing. I was scared. Scared of standing up to my father, of losing everything I'd worked for. But none of it mattered. None of it was worth losing her. Jeremiah looked up at him, his dark eyes searching Charles's face. "Do you think she'd be proud of you now?" he asked, his voice trembling. Charles hesitated, the question piercing through him like a blade. "I don't know," he said honestly, "but I'm going to do everything I can to make sure she would be." The court battle. 2 weeks later, the Whittaker mansion was abuzz with activity. The housekeeper, Mrs. Peterson, and the gardener, Mr. Jenkins, had been called as witnesses to speak on Charles's behalf. His lawyer, David, had spent countless hours preparing for the custody hearing, building a case that highlighted Charles's efforts to provide Jeremiah with a stable, loving home. The hearing itself was held in a small, nondescript courtroom, the walls lined with faded wood paneling. Charles sat at the defendant's table, his hands folded neatly in front of him. Jeremiah sat beside him, his small frame dwarfed by the oversized chair. Marcia sat on the opposite side of the room, her expression hard and unyielding. She wore a sharp navy suit that seemed designed to project authority, and her lawyer, a tall, imposing man with a booming voice, was already laying into Charles. "Mr. Whittaker," the lawyer began, pacing in front of the judge, "you claim to care about Jeremiah's well-being, yet you were absent from his life for over a decade. Can you explain why?" Charles stood, his back straight and his voice steady. "I can't undo the mistakes I made," he said firmly, "but I can take responsibility for them. I wasn't there when I should have been, but I'm here now. Jeremiah came to me because he had no one else, and I'm not going to let him down again." The lawyer smirked, turning to the judge. "Isn't it convenient that Mr. Whittaker suddenly found his paternal instincts after years of ignoring his responsibilities?" David rose to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. That's pure speculation and inflammatory." "Sustained," the judge said, her gaze stern. Marcia's lawyer continued, but Charles held his ground, answering every question with calm determination. He spoke about the changes he had made to accommodate Jeremiah, the art supplies he had bought, the room he had prepared for him. He described the mornings they spent together, the small moments of trust they were building. When it was David's turn to speak, he called Jeremiah to the stand. The boy looked small and vulnerable as he climbed into the witness chair, but his voice was steady as he answered the questions. "Do you feel safe living with Mr. Whittaker?" David asked. Jeremiah nodded. "Yes." "And do you want to stay with him?" Jeremiah hesitated, glancing at Charles before nodding again. "I do. He makes me feel like I belong somewhere." David smiled softly, thanking Jeremiah before stepping back. Marcia's lawyer tried to rattle him, but the boy's answers remained consistent, his quiet determination shining through. The verdict. After hours of deliberation, the judge delivered her ruling. "This court finds that Charles Whittaker has demonstrated a sincere commitment to Jeremiah's well-being. While his past absence is concerning, the evidence presented shows that he has taken significant steps to provide a stable, loving environment. Custody is awarded to Mr. Whittaker." Charles felt a rush of relief as the words sank in. He glanced at Jeremiah, who was looking at him with wide, disbelieving eyes. For the first time, the boy's walls seemed to crumble, and he threw himself into Charles's arms, his small frame trembling with emotion. Charles held him tightly, his own eyes stinging with tears. "We're going to be okay," he whispered. "I promise." Rebuilding trust and rediscovering love. The days following the custody ruling were a mixture of relief and uncertainty. Charles had won the legal battle, but he knew the fight for Jeremiah's trust, and the right to call himself a father, was far from over. The boy remained guarded, his moments of vulnerability fleeting and rare. Charles couldn't blame him. After all, he was a stranger stepping into a role he should have filled years ago. The mansion, once a place of cold solitude, was slowly beginning to feel alive again. Jeremiah's presence brought a kind of energy Charles hadn't felt in years. The sound of pencil scratching against paper had replaced the oppressive silence that once filled the halls. But despite these small changes, the weight of their shared past lingered like a shadow, unspoken but ever present, an unexpected invitation. One morning, as the sun cast its golden light across the snowy grounds, Charles found Jeremiah in the library. The boy was sitting cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by stacks of books he had pulled from the shelves. His sketchbook lay open beside him, and he was carefully copying an illustration of a knight from one of the old volumes. Charles watched from the doorway for a moment before stepping inside. "You're up early," he said, his tone light. Jeremiah glanced up, his expression neutral. "Couldn't sleep." Charles nodded, pulling a chair over and sitting down across from him. He hesitated, then pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket. "I have something for you," he said, sliding it across the table. Jeremiah eyed the paper suspiciously before picking it up and unfolding it. His eyes widened as he read the contents. It was a flyer for an art workshop being held at a local community center. "They have classes every Saturday," Charles explained. "I thought you might like to check it out. Meet other kids who love art as much as you do." Jeremiah looked at him, his expression unreadable. "Why would you do this?" Charles leaned back in his chair, his hands resting on the armrests. "Because I know how much art means to you," he said simply, "and because I want you to have every opportunity to follow your dreams." Jeremiah stared at the flyer for a long moment before nodding. "Okay," he said quietly. "I'll go." The workshop. The following Saturday, Charles drove Jeremiah to the community center. The boy was quiet during the ride, his hands clutching his sketchbook like a lifeline. When they arrived, the parking lot was already bustling with parents and children, their voices filling the crisp morning air. Jeremiah hesitated as they approached the entrance, his steps slowing. "You don't have to come in," he said, his voice barely audible. Charles smiled gently. "I'll wait in the car. Take your time." Jeremiah nodded, his grip on his sketchbook tightening as he disappeared through the double doors. Charles watched him go, a mix of pride and anxiety swirling in his chest. Inside, Jeremiah found himself in a brightly lit room filled with easels, paints, and smiling faces. The instructor, a kind woman with graying hair and paint-smeared hands, welcomed him warmly and guided him to a seat. The other kids were busy setting up their supplies, chatting excitedly about their projects. Jeremiah kept to himself at first, his head down as he sketched quietly. But as the class went on, the instructor noticed his talent and encouraged him to share his work. Slowly, he began to open up, his confidence growing with each stroke of his pencil. By the time the class ended, Jeremiah had made a few tentative friends and was already looking forward to the next session. A trip down memory lane. That evening, Jeremiah returned home with a spark in his eyes that Charles hadn't seen before. He showed Charles the drawings he had worked on during the workshop, his voice animated as he described the techniques he had learned. "You've got real talent," Charles said, his tone filled with genuine admiration. "Your mom would be so proud." Jeremiah's expression softened at the mention of his mother. "She used to take me to parks to draw," he said quietly. "She'd bring a blanket and some sandwiches, and we'd spend the whole day sketching." Charles smiled wistfully, his own memories of Lila flooding back. "She loved being outdoors," he said. "I remember she used to drag me to every art exhibit in the city. I didn't know much about art, but she had this way of making everything seem magical." Jeremiah looked at him, a flicker of curiosity in his eyes. "What else do you remember about her?" Charles hesitated, then stood and walked over to a small cabinet in the corner of the room. He pulled out an old photo album and brought it back to the table. "These," he said, opening the album to reveal a series of photographs. "These are the memories I've held on to." The photos told a story of love and loss, of stolen moments and shared dreams. There was a picture of Lila laughing in a park, her hands covered in paint. Another of her holding a small, scrappy bouquet of wildflowers. Jeremiah leaned closer, his fingers brushing against the images as if trying to connect with a past he'd never known. "She was beautiful," Jeremiah said softly. "She was," Charles agreed, his voice tinged with emotion. "And she was the strongest person I've ever known." A new beginning. Over the next few weeks, Charles and Jeremiah began to settle into a rhythm. They shared meals, worked on puzzles in the evenings, and spent time in the art room Charles had set up for Jeremiah. The boys' walls slowly began to come down, and Charles found himself looking forward to their moments together. One afternoon, as they sat by the fireplace, Jeremiah asked a question that caught Charles off guard. "Do you think I'll ever be as good as Mom?" Charles looked at him, his heart swelling with pride. "I think you'll be better," he said. "You have her talent, but you also have something else, your own voice, your own perspective. That's what makes your art special." Jeremiah smiled, the kind of smile that reached his eyes and lit up his entire face. For the first time, Charles felt like he was truly beginning to understand what it meant to be a father. The shadows return. But just as things seemed to be improving, trouble loomed on the horizon. One evening, Charles received a call from David. "We've got a problem," the lawyer said, his tone grim. "What kind of problem?" Charles asked, his chest tightening. "Marcia isn't backing down," David explained. "She's appealing the custody decision, and she's digging into your past. If she finds anything she can use against you, she'll try to turn it into a weapon." Charles clenched his jaw, his mind racing. He had made mistakes in his life, mistakes that could be twisted into ammunition. But he wasn't going to let Marcia take Jeremiah away, not after everything they had been through. "Let her dig," he said firmly. "I'm not hiding anything. Jeremiah belongs here, and I'll do whatever it takes to prove it." As he hung up the phone, Charles glanced toward the living room, where Jeremiah was sketching by the fire. The boy looked up and offered him a small smile, completely unaware of the battle still raging behind the scenes. Charles took a deep breath, his resolve hardening. He had fought for his son once, and he was prepared to do it again. This time, he wouldn't let fear or doubt hold him back. A trial of hearts. The days following David's ominous call were filled with an undercurrent of tension that Charles couldn't shake. Marcia's appeal wasn't just a legal battle. It was a direct challenge to everything Charles was trying to rebuild. He knew that any misstep could tip the scales against him. Yet, amidst the stress, he found solace in Jeremiah's slow but steady transformation. A snowy bonding moment. One bright morning, Charles decided to take a break from the legal preparation and focus on Jeremiah. Outside, the mansion's sprawling grounds were blanketed in fresh snow, glistening under the winter sun. Charles knocked on Jeremiah's door and peeked inside. The boy was sitting at his desk, engrossed in yet another intricate sketch. His hands moved with practiced precision, bringing life to a snowy landscape that mirrored the scene outside. "Put on your coat," Charles said, a rare smile lighting his face. "We're going outside." Jeremiah looked up, his pencil hovering midair. "Outside? Why?" "Because sometimes life isn't just about drawing it. Sometimes you have to live it," Charles replied. Jeremiah hesitated, but something about Charles's tone, calm, gentle, and inviting, made him nod. Moments later, they were trudging through the snow, their boots crunching against the icy ground. Charles led Jeremiah to an open field at the edge of the property, where the snow lay untouched. "All right," he said, clapping his gloved hands together. "Let's make some memories." Jeremiah gave him a skeptical look. "What kind of memories?" Charles smirked, picking up a handful of snow. Before Jeremiah could react, a perfectly packed snowball sailed through the air and hit him square in the chest. "Hey!" Jeremiah exclaimed, his face a mixture of surprise and amusement. Charles shrugged, feigning innocence. "What? I thought you wanted to live the moment." For a split second, Jeremiah stood frozen. Then, a mischievous grin spread across his face. He dropped his sketchbook in the snow, scooped up a handful of snow, and hurled it at Charles with surprising accuracy. The next few minutes were filled with laughter as they launched snowballs at each other, dodging and ducking behind makeshift barriers. For the first time since Jeremiah arrived, Charles heard the boys' unrestrained laughter, a sound so pure and joyful it brought tears to his eyes. Eventually, they collapsed into the snow, breathless and grinning. Jeremiah turned to Charles, his cheeks flushed from the cold. "You're not so bad, you know," he said with a shy smile. Charles chuckled, brushing snow off his coat. "I'll take that as a compliment." The hidden sketch. That evening, as the warmth of the fireplace chased away the chill from their snowy adventure, Jeremiah retreated to his room to work on a new sketch. Charles, curious, decided to check on him. He knocked softly before entering and found the boy hunched over his desk, his pencil flying across the paper. "What are you working on?" Charles asked, stepping closer. Jeremiah stiffened slightly, his hand moving to cover the page. "It's nothing," he mumbled. Charles raised an eyebrow. "Come on now. I've seen your work. It's never nothing." Reluctantly, Jeremiah slid the sketchbook toward Charles. The drawing was a striking image of two figures in a snowy field, their faces turned upward as snowflakes fell around them. One of the figures was clearly Jeremiah, his small frame captured with remarkable detail. The other figure was unmistakably Charles, his face softened by a rare smile. Charles stared at the drawing, his throat tightening. "This is incredible," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You've captured." "Today," Jeremiah interrupted, his voice quiet. "I drew today." Charles felt a lump form in his throat. "Thank you, Jeremiah," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "This means more to me than you know." Jeremiah shrugged, but the corners of his mouth quirked upward in a small, satisfied smile. The ghosts of the past. Later that night, as Charles sat in his study, he couldn't stop thinking about the sketch. It was a reminder of how far they had come, and how much further they still had to go. The threat of Marcia's appeal loomed large, and Charles knew he couldn't afford to lose. He opened the wooden box on his desk, pulling out Lila's letters once more. There was one he hadn't read yet, a letter he had avoided since the day it arrived. His hands trembled as he unfolded the paper, the words leaping off the page like ghosts from his past. "Charles, this is the last letter I'll write. I don't know if you'll ever read it, but I need to say this anyway. I forgive you. For everything. For walking away, for leaving me to face the world alone. I understand now that you were scared, and I was angry for a long time. But that anger doesn't matter anymore. What matters is Jeremiah. He's the best thing I've ever done, and he deserves a father who loves him. If you're reading this, it means he's found you. Please, Charles, don't let him go." Charles set the letter down, his vision blurring with tears. Lila's words were a plea, a final request from the woman he had loved and lost. He had failed her once, but he wouldn't fail her again. He picked up his phone and called David. "What's our next move?" he asked, his voice steady despite the storm raging in his chest. David sighed. "Marcia's lawyers are digging, but so far, they've got nothing concrete. We need to focus on building your case, showing the judge that you're not just capable of caring for Jeremiah, but that you've already started to build a real relationship with him." Charles nodded, his determination hardening. "Then let's make sure they see that." A step toward healing. The next morning, Charles decided it was time to share something with Jeremiah, something he had kept hidden for too long. He led the boy to his study and opened a drawer, pulling out a small, worn photo album. "This," he said, placing the album on the desk, "is a part of your mom's story." Jeremiah's eyes widened as he flipped through the pages. The photos were a mix of candid shots and posed portraits, each one capturing a moment from Lila's life. There were pictures of her painting in a sunny garden, laughing at a picnic, and holding a bouquet of wildflowers. "She kept those flowers for weeks," Charles said, his voice soft. said they reminded her of happiness. Jeremiah traced a finger over one of the pictures. She looked so happy. She was, Charles replied. She had a way of finding joy in the smallest things, and she loved you more than anything in the world. Jeremiah looked up at him, his eyes brimming with tears. I miss her, he whispered. I miss her too, Charles said, his own voice trembling. But she's still with us, Jeremiah. In the memories we keep and the love we share, she'd be proud of you. I know she would. For the first time, Jeremiah leaned into Charles, resting his head against his shoulder. Charles froze for a moment, then wrapped an arm around the boy, holding him close. It was a small gesture, but it felt monumental, a step toward healing the wounds of the past. The ultimate test and the power of redemption. The day of the final custody hearing arrived sooner than Charles had anticipated. The mansion that morning was unusually quiet, the kind of silence that seeped into every corner like a creeping shadow. Outside, the snow-covered ground sparkled under the weak winter sun, a serene contrast to the storm brewing in Charles's heart. Jeremiah sat at the kitchen table, eating breakfast in silence. His movements were slow, almost mechanical, as he poked at his scrambled eggs. The boy had been quieter than usual over the past few days, the weight of the impending court decision hanging heavily over him. Charles watched him from across the room, his heart aching at the sight. You ready for today? Charles asked, his voice calm but laced with concern. Jeremiah shrugged, not meeting his gaze. I guess. Charles walked over and placed a reassuring hand on the boy's shoulder. No matter what happens in that courtroom, I want you to know one thing. You are not alone. I'm here for you, Jeremiah. Always. The boy looked up at him then, his dark eyes filled with a mixture of fear and fragile hope. He nodded, his lips pressing together in a thin line. Okay, he whispered. The courtroom showdown. The courtroom was packed with people, lawyers, clerks, and a few curious onlookers. The air buzzed with anticipation as the judge entered, her stern gaze sweeping across the room. Charles sat at the defendant's table with Jeremiah by his side, their lawyer David Thompson organizing his notes. Across the aisle, Marcia Reed sat with her own lawyer, her expression a mask of steely determination. The proceedings began with opening statements, each side laying out their case. Marcia's lawyer wasted no time painting a damning picture of Charles, highlighting his years of absence and questioning his sudden interest in Jeremiah's life. This is a man, the lawyer declared, his voice booming through the courtroom, who has spent over a decade ignoring his responsibilities. And now, after years of silence, he expects us to believe he's ready to be a father. Charles sat stone-faced, his hands folded neatly in front of him. He refused to let the man's words rattle him, but he could feel Jeremiah shifting uncomfortably beside him. When it was David's turn, he rose with calm confidence. My client has acknowledged his past mistakes, he began, and he has taken full responsibility for them. But this case is not about punishing Charles Whittaker for the man he used to be. It's about determining what is best for Jeremiah. David went on to describe the steps Charles had taken to create a safe, nurturing environment for the boy. He spoke of the art room, the community center workshop, and the memories they had begun building together. This is a story of redemption, David concluded, and a father's commitment to doing better. Jeremiah speaks. The most pivotal moment of the hearing came when Jeremiah was called to testify. The boy's small frame seemed even smaller as he climbed into the witness chair, his hands clutching the edges of the seat. The judge leaned forward, her expression softening. Jeremiah, she said gently, you don't need to be nervous. Just tell us how you feel, in your own words. Jeremiah nodded, his gaze flickering to Charles for reassurance. Taking a deep breath, he began to speak. When I first came to Mr. Whittaker's house, he said, his voice quiet but steady, I didn't know what to expect. I thought, maybe he wouldn't want me, like everyone else. Charles felt his heart clench at the boy's words, but he forced himself to remain composed. But he didn't turn me away, Jeremiah continued. He let me stay, and he tried. He showed me he cared, even when I didn't make it easy. Jeremiah paused, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. I know he made mistakes, but he's different now. He listens to me. He believes in me. And I want to stay with him. The courtroom was silent, the weight of Jeremiah's words hanging in the air like a tangible presence. Even Marcia looked taken aback, her hardened expression faltering for a brief moment. The judge nodded, her gaze thoughtful. Thank you, Jeremiah. You've been very brave. The judge's decision. After hours of deliberation, the judge returned to deliver her verdict. The room fell silent as she began to speak. This case has been a difficult one, she said, her tone measured. It is clear that both parties care deeply for Jeremiah and want what is best for him. However, after reviewing the evidence and hearing the testimonies, I believe that Jeremiah's best interests lie with the person who has shown the most commitment to his well-being in recent months. She paused, her gaze sweeping across the room before landing on Charles. Custody is awarded to Mr. Whittaker. Charles felt a wave of relief wash over him, his shoulders sagging as the tension drained from his body. Beside him, Jeremiah's face lit up with a smile so pure and joyful that it brought tears to Charles's eyes. Marcia stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. This isn't over, she said, her voice trembling with frustration. I'll be watching you, Charles. Don't think for a second I'll let you mess this up. Charles met her gaze, his expression calm but resolute. I won't, he said simply. A new chapter. The days that followed were a whirlwind of emotions, but through it all, Charles and Jeremiah began to find their rhythm. The boys' laughter echoed through the mansion more frequently, and Charles found himself smiling in ways he hadn't in years. One evening, as they sat by the fireplace, Jeremiah pulled out his sketchbook and handed it to Charles. I made this for you, he said shyly. Charles opened the book to find a series of drawings that told the story of their journey. Jeremiah standing in the snow outside the mansion, the two of them having a snowball fight, and finally, a drawing of them sitting together by the fire, their expressions filled with quiet contentment. It's incredible, Charles said, his voice thick with emotion. Thank you, Jeremiah. This means everything to me. Jeremiah smiled, his walls fully down for the first time. You're not so bad, he teased. Charles laughed, pulling the boy into a hug. And you, he said, his voice warm, are the best thing that's ever happened to me. As the fire crackled softly in the background, the two of them sat together, their bond stronger than ever. It wasn't perfect, and it wouldn't be easy, but for the first time, both of them felt like they were exactly where they belonged. A new legacy, facing the shadows. Despite the courtroom victory, Charles knew the battle wasn't truly over. Marcia's warning echoed in his mind. She would be watching, waiting for a slip-up. But instead of focusing on fear, Charles poured his energy into rebuilding the foundation of trust between him and Jeremiah. One snowy afternoon, as Charles was organizing some old files in his study, he came across a folder labeled Estate Legacy, Whittaker Foundation. Inside were documents detailing the charitable organization his late father had started decades ago. The foundation had been little more than a tax shelter during his father's time, but Charles saw potential in it now, a chance to build something meaningful, something his father never had. Jeremiah, Charles called from the study doorway. The boy looked up from his sketchbook, where he had been working on a new piece near the fireplace. Yeah, come here. I want to show you something. Jeremiah hesitated but got up, shuffling over. Charles laid the folder on the desk and opened it, showing Jeremiah the old plans for the foundation. This was something my father started, but it never became what it could have been, Charles explained. I want to change that. I was thinking, maybe we could focus on supporting young artists, kids like you, who have talent but don't always have the resources. Jeremiah's eyes widened. You mean, like, art supplies, workshops? Charles nodded. Exactly. We could even create scholarships to help kids go to art schools. Jeremiah's face lit up, and for the first time, Charles saw true excitement in his son's eyes. "That would be amazing," Jeremiah said. "Mom always said art was for everyone, not just the rich." "She was right," Charles said, smiling. "And with your help, we can make that happen." Jeremiah's chest puffed up slightly, pride flickering across his face. "You really want me to help?" "Of course," Charles replied. "You're the heart of this, Jeremiah. You know what it feels like to want to create but not have the tools. Who better to guide me than you?" For the first time, Jeremiah felt like he belonged, truly belonged. Not just as a guest in Charles's house, but as a partner in something bigger, something that mattered. A visit to Lila's grave. A few days later, Charles and Jeremiah took a trip together to Lila's grave. The snow had melted slightly, revealing patches of grass beneath the old oak tree where she was buried. Charles carried a small bouquet of white lilies, her favorite, while Jeremiah carried his sketchbook. They stood together in silence for a moment, the winter wind rustling the branches above them. Finally, Charles knelt, placing the lilies gently against the headstone. "I should have come here sooner," he said, his voice trembling. "I should have been better for you, Lila. But I promise you this, I'm going to honor your memory. I'm going to make sure Jeremiah has the life you wanted for him." Jeremiah knelt beside him, pulling out his sketchbook. "I drew this for her," he said, holding up a drawing of Lila sitting under a tree, surrounded by flowers. Her face in the sketch was soft and peaceful, her hands holding a paintbrush as she smiled. Charles's breath caught in his throat as he took the drawing. "It's beautiful," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "She would have loved this." Jeremiah placed the drawing carefully on the grave, anchoring it with a small rock. "She used to say that art could keep people alive," he said quietly. "That as long as we remembered her, she'd never really be gone." Charles placed a hand on Jeremiah's shoulder, his grip firm but comforting. "She's still with us," he said, "in every memory, every story, and every time you put pencil to paper." Jeremiah nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. "I think she'd be proud of us." "I know she would," Charles replied, his voice steady. "And we're going to make sure she has even more reasons to be proud." A celebration of new beginnings. Spring arrived with a fresh sense of purpose. The Whittaker mansion, once cold and empty, had been transformed. The rooms were filled with color. Jeremiah's sketches and paintings hung on the walls, his creative touch bringing warmth and life to the space. The Whittaker Foundation for the Arts was officially launched in late April. The first event was held at the community center where Jeremiah had attended his workshop, and Charles spared no expense to make it a celebration of creativity. Easels and canvases were set up for children to paint, while professional artists gave demonstrations and shared their stories. Jeremiah stood at the center of it all, his sketchbook in hand as he helped other kids with their drawings. He was no longer the quiet, uncertain boy who had knocked on Charles's door that snowy Christmas Eve. He had found his voice, his purpose, and a family. At the end of the event, Charles stood to give a speech. He glanced at Jeremiah, who was watching from the front row, and felt a swell of pride. "Today isn't just about art," Charles began, his voice carrying across the room. "It's about second chances. It's about the power of creation, the power of hope, and the power of family. This foundation isn't just a legacy for the Whittaker name. It's a legacy for all of us, a reminder that it's never too late to change, to grow, and to make a difference." The crowd erupted into applause, but Charles only had eyes for Jeremiah. The boy beamed at him, his smile wide and genuine. In that moment, Charles knew he had finally done something right. Epilogue. A portrait of love. Months later, Charles stood in the art room he had built for Jeremiah, watching as the boy worked on his latest masterpiece. The room was filled with the scent of fresh paint and the sound of soft music playing in the background. "What are you working on?" Charles asked, stepping closer. Jeremiah turned, revealing the canvas he had been working on. It was a portrait of Charles and Lila, standing together under a tree with Jeremiah between them. The expressions on their faces were serene, their features glowing with warmth and love. "It's how I imagine us," Jeremiah said softly. "If things had been different." Charles swallowed hard, his chest tightening with emotion. "It's perfect," he said, his voice thick. "Just like you." Jeremiah smiled, setting down his brush. He walked over and hugged Charles, the gesture no longer hesitant but filled with trust and affection. "I'm glad I knocked on your door," Jeremiah said, his voice muffled against Charles's chest. Charles held him close, his heart full. "And I'm glad I opened it." As the sun set outside the mansion, casting golden light across the walls, father and son stood together, their bond unbreakable. It wasn't a perfect story. It was messy, flawed, and full of hard-won victories. But it was theirs, and that, Charles realized, was more than enough.